Welcome to our sponsored program's Budgeting Basics. These videos are designed to help you understand the budgeting process and enable you to create a draft budget for your sponsored project. Today we are looking at cost sharing, when in response to sponsor guidance, JMU shares in the cost of running a sponsored program. Cost sharing can sometimes seem intimidating, but it usually shouldn't prevent you from pursuing a funding opportunity. I do want to say that these videos don't replace working with our grants specialists. Our grants specialists here in OSP are experts in the nuances of uniform guidance and know details beyond what we will get into here. They also read through the rules for your specific programs to make sure to catch any unique rules that apply. Your assigned grants specialist will work with you individually to construct a budget that meets your needs and complies with all the sponsor and JMU rules and regulations. This is especially important for cost sharing, where sponsors often have unique rules about what can be included and how it can be budgeted. Some external funding opportunities require or encourage applicants to participate in cost sharing, in which, as I said, JMU pays for a share of the costs of the proposed project. Why would they do this? Well, some sponsors use cost sharing as a way of determining an applicant's commitment to the project, although as we will see, generally only private or foundation funders. Secondly, though, requiring institutions to share the costs can stretch the sponsor's funds, enabling them to fund more projects. Before we expand on that, we need to understand the difference between mandatory and voluntary cost sharing. Mandatory cost sharing is when a sponsor requires the cost share in order to even consider the proposal. If you don't include the cost share, then your proposal won't meet the requirements set out in the solicitation or NOFO. One such example is the NEA Grants for Arts Projects, which requires a one-to-one match, meaning that for every dollar the federal government funds, the institution must provide $1 or equivalent in match. For voluntary cost sharing, the sponsor doesn't require it, but the institution includes it, usually to make the proposal more competitive. There's a common misconception that including cost sharing will always make your proposal more competitive. However, when it comes to federal funding, it is actually illegal for agencies to consider voluntary committed cost sharing in merit review for research proposals. For this reason, some agencies, such as the National Science Foundation, actually go so far as forbidding its inclusion entirely. If you're wondering what committed means here, it basically just means something that's explicitly included in the budget justification, or narrative as being provided by the university, particularly if there's an explicit dollar value amount attached to it. Because of that, JMU generally strongly discourages voluntary committed cost sharing. If you think your proposal warrants an exception, please reach out to OSP early. As mentioned, though, cost sharing is a necessary part of some funding opportunities, so let's dive into it. Cost sharing generally takes two forms: in-kind contributions and cash matching. In-kind contributions are a type of cost share in which JMU provides goods and/or services, but money is not necessarily involved. For example, you might have some student volunteers working on your project, or you might be using campus space but not paying for it. The other kind is cash match. As the name suggests, this requires the applicant to use actual monetary funds to support the project. Examples here can include salary payments if JMU pays someone to do work on the sponsored project, or equipment or materials that JMU purchases for the project but doesn't charge to the sponsored program. It's important to know what type or types of cost sharing are allowed by your program if you need to include it. Before we dive into the how of cost sharing, how to find its value and put it on your budget, let's review some of the regulations around cost sharing. First, the costs must be necessary and reasonable for completing the project. So, for example, if you have an administrator who is doing some work managing your project, you can potentially include part of their salary as your cost share, but not all of it, assuming they are doing other work as well. That's because the salary costs for doing this other work aren't necessary for your project to be completed. The second point follows from this. If the costs are necessary and reasonable for your specific project, then they also shouldn't be part of another project as well. So the cost sharing can't overlap between projects. Any cost share can be included on at most one proposal. The third point is very important: all committed cost sharing, so all cost sharing that's in your budget justification, and/or narrative must be tracked so it can be audited. This actually has two aspects. First, we will need some way to actually track that your cost share happened. So, for example, if you have student volunteers as your cost share, you'll need to track the number of volunteers and the hours they worked. But secondly, we also have to document how we came up with the value of the cost share, especially for in-kind contributions. We can't just take you at your word that the rental value of some piece of equipment is $100. We need to be able to back that up if we're audited. This is why it's very important to start working with a grant specialist early when you're working on a proposal with cost sharing, and to be prepared to help gather the necessary documentation. What is this documentation? For this, I'll refer you to an internal cost sharing guide which we have on our website. I'll show you where you can find it in a minute. Within this guide, you'll find a table with some common forms of in-kind contributions, how we typically determine their valuations, and what sort of documentation we will usually need. We won't go over every aspect of the table, but I will mention that it's often easiest to determine the valuation when you have someone donating effort, that is time, to your project. It gets more complicated with equipment, where we often need to include depreciation. The list that you'll find in this internal guide is not exhaustive, so if you have some type of in-kind contribution that isn't listed here, you'll need to work with your grant specialist to determine its valuation and appropriate documentation. Again, please reach out early enough that we have time to assist you. The internal-only guide also has a wealth of information about cash match, which perhaps surprisingly can be a bit more complicated in practice. We recommend reading the guide and then speaking with your AUH about some of the possibilities listed there. I also want to note that there is an additional form you'll need to complete if your cash match exceeds $10,000, which can slow down the process quite a bit. We will need this form completed before we can route your proposal for internal approval, so again, please start the process early if this applies. So now let me show you where you can find this guide. Please go to the section on budget development and then overview templates and resources. On this page, which you've seen a few times in these videos, you can find our templates down here on the left. However, there's also the section Other Resources to Review up here on the right. This is where you will find our cost sharing guide. This asterisk at the end reminds us that it is a JMU only internal document, and so you'll need to use your JMU login in order to access it. Now, what about including cost share on your line item budget? Note that some of our templates don't include columns for cost sharing. For example, our NSF one does not, since the NSF generally does not permit cost sharing in its programs. However, you'll find it on most of our templates, including this one, which is our generic template. Once you, together with your grant specialist, have done the work of determining the value of your cost share, including it in the budget is usually fairly simple. If it's cash, it will go in one of the columns labeled Match in Cash. On the other hand, if it's in kind, it will go in one of the columns labeled Match in Kind. As to which one, that depends on which year this match is coming in. So for example, if you are going to spend the money in year 1 for your in-cash match, it would go in this column. Year 2, it would go in that column. So then the only other thing that we really need to know is what row is it going to go in. So let's say, for example, I am a principal investigator and I am going to devote some time to this project. I'm going to draw my salary for that time and I'm going to be compensated for it. If my base salary is, say, $90,000 and I'm going to donate 1 month of work on it, and we'll say I am a 12-month employee, so we use calendar months, then I could do this exactly the same as I did in our videos on paying personnel, and it works out to be this value. You can work with your grant specialist to determine just what the value is and put that in directly. If you're not sure where this formula came from, the dividing by 12, please look back at one of our videos, specifically the one on paying JMU personnel. On the other hand, let's say maybe I have some undergraduate students that are going to be donating some volunteer work on this project. We'll say that they're going to be donating 10 hours each. I'm going to have 30 students. And together with my grant specialist, I've determined that the hourly rate that's appropriate if we were going to pay them, which we're not since they're volunteers, is $15 an hour. Then this would be an in-kind match, and to find the value, we would end up just multiplying these numbers together. So that's an example of where an in-cash match might go and where an in-kind match might go. Now you might notice that even though this is under personnel costs up here for our in-cash match, the FICA costs were not automatically calculated and included. That's because sponsors generally differ as to whether or not you can include JMU's FICA contribution as part of the cash match. If you do want to include it, or you are allowed to include it, you can copy this formula from this cell over to that cell, which will automatically calculate it based on the number above. Please work with your grants specialist to determine whether or not the FICA contribution can be included. If you're not sure what this FICA contribution is, where it comes from, and what it means, refer back to our video on JMU personnel costs. The other place where you'll often see in-kind contributions coming in is down here in these sections down here. So for example, if you are purchasing supplies or equipment for this project or donating equipment, use of it temporarily, we can put the value that you come up with your grants specialist in one of these rows down here, depending on which one is most appropriate. We'll say maybe we have $1,500 of equipment costs that are being donated. You can see other direct costs down here: printing, postage, photocopying, etc., etc. The last one I want to mention is other, and this is one that often comes up frequently for in-kind contributions. One common example, for example, is if you are using JMU space that has a typical rental value, but you are not actually going to charge that rental cost to the grant. So we've seen a few examples where things come in here. I just want to show you how this worksheet automatically determines the costs. Okay, so here's our cash match cost and our in-kind costs. We'll throw in some costs for the direct costs just to have something to compare it to. Here, when we look at this section down here, okay? So the first one is the total direct costs requested from the sponsor, which would not include our cost sharing. Then we have the F&A, or the indirect costs. Please note that we do not charge indirect costs on any of the cost sharing costs. So this is based entirely on the modified total direct costs that are charged to the sponsor. Well, requested from the sponsor. So this then is the sum of these two, which is the total amount that we are going to ask the sponsor to give us. The next two columns are our cost sharing, the in-kind contribution and the cash match contribution. Since these are real honest-to-goodness costs that JMU is going to cover, they are included in the total program costs. I'll note that in addition to appearing in the budget, your cost sharing also needs to be included on the budget justification, where you'll also need to explain why the items you are using as your cost share are necessary and reasonable for your project. This is something that PIs often forget about, but it's key to getting your budget, including the cost share, approved by the sponsor. I hope this video has been helpful. If you're just starting the process of figuring out what your cost share will be, please look at our internal guide. It does have quite a few examples. We here in the Office of Sponsored Programs Administrative Services look forward to working with you.